Well, welcome to another Friday night. We've been looking a bit deeper at the 60 characteristics of complex trauma, and today we come to what is probably one of the most commonly known characteristics, emotional dysregulation. And I've talked about it a lot, but today I want to dig into it in a bit more detail with some new research that I find quite fascinating. So let me begin by just giving you kind of a definition of emotional dysregulation. It's a term used to describe an emotional response that is poorly regulated and does not fall within the traditionally accepted range of emotional reaction. It may also be referred to as mood swings. When someone is experiencing emotional dysregulation, they may have angry outbursts, anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, self-harm, and other self-damaging behaviors. Over time, the condition may interfere with your quality of life, your social interactions, and relationships at home and work. In other words, it's something that has consequences that begin to cause very important parts of your life to break down and fall apart. So when we look at emotional dysregulation from the perspective of complex trauma, what we're talking about is a stress system, which we all have a stress system that is overactive. It's working too much and it's overreactive. So that results in hypervigilance. You're always looking for danger. You're always on guard, or hyperarousal, 0 to 100 in a nanosecond, or an overactive startle response, like when you scare a cat and it jumps. Often, emotional dysregulation in people gets diagnosed in children as ADHD. In adults, often they would get a borderline personality diagnosis. So I want to kind of talk today about the information that has come out in a book that Dr. Bruce Perry, a leading trauma researcher in children for over 30 years, he's paired up with Oprah Winfrey to write this book called What Happened to You. And what it's basically saying in the title is, we used to say to people who were in jail, who got into drugs, "What's wrong with you?" But because of understanding trauma, the better question is, what happened to you? What you're doing is a response to what happened to you. It's not necessarily pointing to what's wrong with you as if it's a moral deficit. It's something happened to you that made you have to respond this way to survive. So trauma is a key piece in understanding so many of these things. So let me begin by talking about why do we get dysregulated? What dysregulates us? So basically, it's anything that activates our stress system. So a couple things that will do that. And I want to give you a series here. Think of the fact of all your internal systems that you have. So you have a system that has kind of a border on what is healthy as far as the amount of water in your body, the temperature of your body, your head space, your mental health state. So if you're in the right parameters, you've got enough food, enough water, you're in a good headspace, you're in balance, and everything is good. But let's say you don't get enough water, or you get cold. It triggers your stress system because you're out of balance. Something is wrong, and if it doesn't get corrected quickly, you're going to be in big trouble. And so you get the sensation of thirst, the sensation of hunger, because your stress system is activated. You shiver because your stress system is activated. So anytime when your basic 12 needs, which we talk about all the time, anytime those aren't met, emotional, physical, relational, spiritual needs, those aren't being met, then your stress system is activated. And that can cause emotional dysregulation. So think of a baby. They're hungry, activates their stress system, they cry. They're cold, activates their stress system, they cry. There's a response that says something's out of balance here. And so our brain is committed to balance, which means the meeting of our needs within certain parameters. And if it's not, those aren't met, stress system activated, and we can dysregulate. The second thing is if we're not connected. So we all need a connection to a safe person, a rock, a stable person, a strong person. And if we're not connected, our stress system is activated. And again, what happens when a baby doesn't feel connected? They cry because their stress system is activated. Next, whenever we have external danger around us, where we could get hurt, it activates our stress system. Next, we all have stress. Stress is a necessary part of life. Every responsibility, task creates some stress. And so our brain is able to manage stress without being overstressed. But if all of a sudden we get a whole bunch of new responsibilities or problems or things that go wrong, our stress system gets activated because we're starting to feel overwhelmed. And then the next one is whenever we go through change, we go into a new situation where we've not been before, new surroundings, new job, new relationships, our stress system is activated. Then, if a past trauma gets triggered, so an old abandonment wound gets triggered, an old hurt gets triggered, we get rejected, we get shamed, that causes our stress system get activated because the fear is it's going to happen again, and so we can get dysregulated. And then the last one is if we're hanging around somebody who's emotionally dysregulated. So they're panicking, they're angry. And what we learn is that emotions are contagious. We pick up other people's emotions. So if they're dysregulated, the tendency is for us to become dysregulated. Oh, Dad's upset. Okay, I can't relax now until Dad calms down. And so those are things that cause dysregulation or potentially cause dysregulation. So let's go to what regulates our emotions. Okay? So a baby cries because it's out of balance. And so it's dysregulated. So it cries, it's hungry, whatever. The parent comes, responds to their cry, and meets their need. It senses they need food, they're cold, they need to get warm. And as it meets the need, the parent also soothes the child. It rubs its back, it rocks the baby, it talks to the baby. And then by doing that, it's connecting with the child. So remember that because we're going to come back to it. So then what you have to understand is that when the parent does this for the child, meets the need, connects, soothes, the parent has to be regulated themselves. They have to be in a calm state so that the baby, when it connects, it's connecting to calmness. That helps regulate the baby. And so what you see then is the parent is providing external regulation for the baby. But as it does that, the child gradually learns how to regulate itself. It learns the tools, the ingredients of being able to regulate itself when it feels dysregulated. It can meet needs. It can connect with people. It has proper soothing type of things. So what you can understand then are two possible things can happen. The baby's not regulated, it cries. What happens if nobody comes? Then it gets more dysregulated. It cries even more. Or, option two, what happens if a parent comes, but the parent is not regulated. They're frustrated, they're angry, they're impatient. The child connects to the parent but picks up their mood, their dysregulation, and that dysregulates them even more. And so there's different kind of options or things that can happen as far as the response to the baby. And so if those two things happen, then the baby is not learning tools to regulate itself. It is finding that being dysregulated only leads to greater dysregulation, because nobody cares enough to come, or everybody sees them as a burden and is annoyed with them, and that leads to greater dysregulation. So let me take that and give you kind of 4 components then that help regulate. So number 1 is rhythm. So Dr. Perry refers to studies that have been done, and it goes like this. While the baby is in the womb, what it hears is the mother's heartbeat, 60 to 80 beats a minute. But it doesn't just hear the mother's heartbeat. That heartbeat causes vibrations in the amniotic fluid, which is pressure changes. And what the child is learning in the womb is that constant rhythmic heartbeat with the sensations of it is safety. It's soothing. It's a warm, safe place. So when the baby is born and it cries, what do parents do? They rock the baby. And if they rock the baby at 60 to 80 beats a minute, the baby has a memory triggered of a safe place where there's that rhythm. And it helps regulate the baby. As the child gets older, what they then may find is when they listen to music, which has a steady, constant beat, that rhythm soothes them. And then they find that walking has a rhythm, dancing has a rhythm, doodling on paper, coloring has a rhythm, cleaning can have a rhythm, sweeping, wiping down counters. A back rub has a rhythm. A massage can have a rhythm. All of those things they then find soothing. It helps regulate them. It activates the memory of the womb and the steady heartbeat rhythm. So rhythm is an important piece in regulation, and we'll come back to that. The second ingredient is connection. That they have to connect to somebody regulated, somebody safe, somebody that's their rock. Third, they need to get their needs met. So if they get their needs met and they connect and there's a rhythm, they can regulate. So what I want you to understand is those 3 things are absolutely necessary. And I'm going to come back to why I'm emphasizing that in just a minute. But then there's another component that comes into play. So a child is hungry, they are dysregulated, they cry. The parent comes, rocks them with a rhythm, connects, soothes them, and meets their need, feeds them. It activates another system, a reward system. And what it is saying is, when you are hungry, cry. That will get your need met. And then now, when your need is met, it's just not being satiated by getting food. Your reward system releases dopamine. That was good. So that helps reinforce, do this, and that helps regulate. There's a 4th thing that the body uses in order to help regulate, and that's the body's own medicine, body's own chemicals. So when a child is dysregulated, it releases 2 chemicals, the body. Number 1, it releases oxytocin. And oxytocin is the love drug that says, I want to connect. I need to connect. And it causes me to run to my rock for connection. The second one is cortisol. And that we know is what releases adrenaline and gives me energy. But what I want you to understand is it's giving you energy to fix the problem that is causing the dysregulation so that you can be regulated again. So cortisol is designed to give you short bursts of energy, motivation to fix a situation that is causing you to be not regulated so that you can be regulated again. And once you're regulated again, you don't need the cortisol anymore. And so part of the problem with cortisol in complex trauma is that it's pumping all the time and you're doing all kinds of energy, but it's not resolving the situation. The need is not being met. You're not being regulated. And that causes tons of different problems. Okay, let's go to how complex trauma messes up this beautiful regulating system. Number one, I want to show you a picture of a brain. So it's an inverted triangle. The brain stem is what develops first, and that regulates your heartbeat, your organs, your digestion, your blood pressure. That's the part that just is totally subconscious. Secondly, what is built is the limbic. So brainstem develops in the womb, then the limbic as the child brain, and that's the emotional center. And then on top is the cortex, which develops last. So that is how our brain develops. So let me give you some things for you to understand. Our brain operates bottom up. So your five senses are bringing in information all the time. It does not start at the cortex to process that information, even though the cortex is the smartest part of your brain. Rather, the information comes in and it is first processed by the brain stem, the most primitive part of your brain. Then it goes up to your limbic. So here's what I want you to understand. Your brain is organized to feel and act before it thinks. The cortex is the thinking. So the brain stem and your limbic brain, the feeling, action things, are where all information is first processed. Now, another thing to understand about that is that your brain stem and your limbic brain don't tell time. Only your cortex tells time. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. So all of this information comes in. Now what your limbic brain and your brain stem and your cortex are all about is trying to make sense of your world. So everything you see and experience, it analyzes, it categorizes, it sorts, trying to make sense. So to a child who sees mom's facial expression, the brain is saying, what does that facial expression mean? And it works on it till it figures it out. Or if dad wags his finger, what does that mean? And so it's organizing, trying to make sense out of their experiences. Somebody rubs their back. Somebody rubs their back with a certain pressure. Somebody else rubs their back with a harder pressure. What's the difference? Is there a difference? What does that mean? What does it mean when mom makes that particular sound, that sigh? What does it mean when somebody makes eye contact with me? All the brain working hard to make sense out of life so you interpret it properly. Okay, now let's bring in trauma. So let's say 30 years ago, you experienced a war. So you heard cannon fire, gunfire, explosions. Okay? So your brain was traumatized, and your brain stem and your limbic brain have a memory of that. Now today, you're walking down the street and you hear a car backfire. That goes in through your five senses and it starts bottom up, brain stem, And what your brain stem and limbic brain do is compare that sound with any other similar sounds. Now remember, your brain doesn't tell time. So your brain hears the car backfire, or 4th of July, they hear fireworks, and they go, that sounds like Vietnam. That was traumatic. And all of a sudden you feel like you're there again. Because it doesn't know it was 50 years ago. It only knows it's the same sound. And so now your stress system goes into overreaction because there's a connection. There's a comparison. It's the same sound, so the same stuff must be happening. Now that signal of the car backfiring or the fireworks will eventually get to your cortex, and you can then process what's going on, and you can see the time difference between now and then. But what I want you to understand is it doesn't start at your cortex. It first goes through your brain stem and your limbic brain, and it compares and it starts to react before your cortex is engaged. And so that's why people can go into a fight-flight response and it hasn't yet reached their cortex. So, big picture. Healing complex trauma is about healing our limbic brain so that we learn to be able to regulate our limbic brain when it gets triggered by connecting to a past trauma. That is a super challenging thing to do. And again, I'll come back to that in just a minute. So, because of how our brain processes bottom up, it sets us up to dysregulate. Because it starts at the brain stem and the limbic brain and compares to anything similar to that from your past. The second thing I want you to see that complex trauma does to mess up the regulating system is the rhythm part. So what happens to a child, comes out of the womb, has had the rhythm of mom's heartbeat, now is hungry, now skins its knee, dysregulates, cries. Nobody comes to rock them. Nobody comes to provide soothing. They have to learn to rock themselves. They have to learn to self-soothe. And so that's where you can see people from complex trauma who go through a dysregulation time in their adult life, and all of a sudden they're rocking, or they're tapping, or they're jiggling their leg. Their body is looking for a rhythm that will help regulate. Now, if they find a rhythm by rocking or jiggling their leg that helps regulate, there's still a problem. Remember, there's 3 parts that are absolutely necessary. There also has to be connection and meeting their need. So if they rock, but their need's not met and they don't connect, they feel a bit regulated but not totally regulated, because the 2 other ingredients aren't there. Now let me take that a bit further to OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. This is about a rhythm thing. This is about trying to regulate my limbic brain through activities. So think of a person who leaves the house and then they can't remember if they locked the door. So they go back and they lock the door and they find out, okay, that helped me relax because I checked. Or let's say a person's outside and then they come back in and they are feeling a bit nervous about where they've been and what they've touched, so they wash their hands and they find out that regulates the dysregulated emotions, the fear in their limbic brain. So now they've learned that if you're leaving the house, make sure you check. That will regulate your brain. If you're out and about and come back home, wash your hands. That'll help regulate the fear in your limbic brain. So then what happens is not only when they washed their hands did it regulate their limbic brain, it also activated their reward system. When they checked the house to make sure it was locked, that also regulated their emotions and activated their reward system. So then what begins to happen is a belief starts to happen that if my limbic brain is feeling dysregulated, there's fear, the solution is wash my hands. The solution is check the house. Maybe I need to check it 2 or 3 times. Maybe I need to shut the light off 2 or 3 times. So now they start an activity that is being used to regulate their limbic brain. And it seems to work. So they start a belief that checking so many times, washing so many times, helps me calm down, helps regulate my brain. So a belief system is now developing. And it seems to be right because it works. The activity, the rhythm, regulates my emotions. Now, what happens if, 2 different scenarios, you've got that belief system now, you leave the house, and you got other things on your mind, and you forget all about your routine of checking until you're a mile down the road. And all of a sudden you go, oh, I forgot to check. What happens now is it activates your stress system. It activates your limbic brain to an even greater degree. Now you're in fear. You can't get on with your day because you didn't check. And so the only way you can get your brain to slow down, to regulate those emotions, is drive all the way back home and check 3 times. The same is true with washing your hands. You got other things on your mind and you forget to wash when you get home. And then you remember you didn't wash, and it just goes through the roof. Okay, there's a second thing that can happen. Let's say you come home and you start washing your hands because you're dysregulated, but you wash it 3 times and you're still dysregulated. It didn't calm you down this time. Well, what does your brain go? Well, let's just keep washing. Let's wash 4 times, 5 times. We'll wash till our brain settles down. So what has happened? And this is so important. The person has started by finding that a rhythm regulates their emotions, but they have gone to a superstitious belief that says, I must do exactly this if I'm going to regulate my emotions. But what you see then is that the limbic brain is in total control. And after a while, even those superstitious beliefs about those activities don't regulate the brain. And the limbic brain is making them a prisoner. And so it is so hard for a person with OCD who is all about the limbic brain and trying to regulate it and thinking they found the solution, only to find that it's not a good solution. It's so hard for them to get to their cortex and look at reality accurately because their limbic brain is in control and is distorting everything to them, making them think if I don't do this, something bad is going to happen. And it becomes a prison to them. The third thing that was so important for regulating emotions was connection. But what we already hinted at is that in complex trauma, that connection doesn't happen. Either the parent doesn't respond to the dysregulated child, they neglect them, ignore them, or the parent comes and connects, but they're dysregulated. They're annoyed at the child. They're impatient with the child. They're angry. And the child picks up that. But what can happen is it's a two-sided thing. They love that the parent connected. So that helped regulate them a little bit, but it left them dysregulated. And so that's where in adult life, a person in an abusive relationship, they can get abused by their partner and get all dysregulated. And then their partner comes and they connect. And it feels good to connect, but it doesn't solve anything. But that comes out of complex trauma. Now, more than that, what happens when the parent doesn't respond or the parent responds in their own dysregulated way is it inflicts new wounds on the child. Because now the child feels rejected. They feel shame. I'm a burden. I'm annoying. They feel all alone. They might even feel abandoned because nobody came. And so it leads to new dysregulating wounds inside of them. Now let me go to the medication part. So we have oxytocin and cortisol. Those are the two that are intended. But what happens to a little child who's got danger all around them because of mom and dad? Violence, anger, neglect, all kinds of different things like that. They're too little to fight. They're too little to flee. So there's no point in having cortisol. There's no point in having oxytocin because nobody cares. So what the brain then does is prepare itself to freeze. And what that means is the brain prepares itself to get hurt. And this is so interesting to understand. Because if a child can't fight or flight, it must freeze. The brain then releases opioids, its own opioids in the system to prepare it to get hurt. So it won't feel it so badly. But also what happens is the brain slows the heartbeat down. In fight or flight, cortisol sped the heartbeat up. But now in freeze, it slows it down, preparing it to get hurt. The child retreats into itself. It doesn't flee outwardly, it flees inwardly into its own fantasy or dissociation, and the child goes to people pleasing. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't be angry, don't hurt me. And so that happens because of complex trauma. So the only way then to regulate the emotions, if it can't fight or flight and resolve it, is let's release opioids to calm the child down. Let's dissociate. That'll regulate the child. Let's people please. That'll regulate the situation. So it's still about regulation. So what happens when they get to adult life and there's still nobody in their life that cares, that's helping them, and they're dysregulated? They need to release opioids in their body. And so people will bang their heads against the wall. They will cut. That will release opioids in their body. They will burn themselves, and that brings back the regulating feelings again. Or they find drugs and alcohol. They find opioid chemicals out there, and those help them feel regulated again. So complex trauma sets people up for cutting, burning their own opioid system, for drugs, synthetic opioid systems, all to help them regulate. So let's move on to healing. There's some very important healing phases. And we've talked about this in other talks in a lot of detail. But let me just quickly go through some of the phases. So the first phase and the first tool is I need tools to help regulate my brainstem and limbic brain when they're dysregulated. In that crisis moment when they're triggered. And so we call that grounding. And so that's where people can use rhythm. They can do breathing, rhythmic breathing. They can walk. They can listen to music. They can tap on pressure points, which is called EFT. Some people count. Some people draw, color. rhythm. They can find rhythms that help regulate them. So what I want you to understand is the starting point for dealing with emotional regulation is not tools for the cortex, because it's not yet engaged. It's tools to ground, to de-escalate the limbic system. And rhythm is a big part of that. Then, once regulated, you can go to the cortex. And as you go to the cortex, then you can tell time again, and you go, you know what just happened felt like 40 years ago, but I'm not there 40 years ago, even though it feels like it's still happening to me. And so then you can go, okay, what happened here? And you can reprocess the event and reprocess the trauma and learn from it. And healing will happen as you do that. Then the third is you don't want to just be living with grounding tools for when you're triggered. What you want to do is start healing your stress system so that it isn't triggered as much, so that it gets to a healthier place that can better handle stress and triggering events. And so, what are tools to help develop an increasingly healthy stress response system? Yoga, for many people, does that. Running, pet therapy, art therapy, all are helpful. But more than that, you have to begin to learn to meet your 12 needs consistently. And you have to begin connecting with safe people. Again, the 3 ingredients now have to become part of your life, not just when you're in a crisis. Then the 4th thing is you have to go back and heal those wounds. And those wounds won't heal unless you talk about them, face them, get honest about them. Bring them to your conscious level. As long as you avoid, as long as you try to stuff them down, deny them, say it doesn't bother me, those wounds are going to keep bleeding into your life today. And then finally, develop a mindfulness. And there's a couple things we mean by that. First of all, develop an inventory time a couple times a day where you go, how am I doing stress-wise? Where's my head at? What's my mental health? What are the main emotions I'm feeling right now? So you keep track of if the stress is building, if your headspace is still good. So develop those inventories. And then, if you go, my headspace isn't good, what do I need to do about it? If my stress is building, what do I need to do about it? And then you go to curiosity. So when you find yourself triggered, you go, what was that about? So instead of getting down on yourself that you were triggered and you went back to maybe some old behaviors, you go, okay, what's going on here? Oh, that's connected to that. Now I know what I need to do. So understand this. A trigger today points to an unhealed wound from the past. A trigger is actually a sign on the road with an arrow that says you need to go here and do some work and some healing. And so develop that curiosity about yourself, about what's happening, what's this trigger all about, and you can learn and grow from it. Let me end by just saying this. Dr. Bruce Perry went to New Zealand and met with the Maori indigenous people. And they wanted him as a consultant to talk about healing methods for trauma and just healing in general. After he spent a week with them, they talked to him, and what they said to him was so impactful for him, and it validates and reinforces so much of what I teach. But what they said to him was this: you guys in the West, you have developed 2 things so well. You can diagnose illnesses. You can diagnose mental health problems. You've got it all categorized. Depression, anxiety, ADHD, ODD, heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, cancer. And then you've got the medications for all of that stuff. You guys have done great in that, and we are so appreciative. But we think you are missing the key foundational ingredient for healing. It's not correct diagnosis and medication, though those are important. The foundational thing that is necessary for healing is connection. And you in the West are a nation that is not connected very well. Connection is not your strong point. So even though you have all these other things but don't have connection, you're missing the key ingredient. And I thought, wow, that is so beautiful, so true. We have to start with connection to safe, healthy people. And we talk about that all the time. Well, that's the end of part one. We're going to take a short break, and I'll come back and we'll do the Christian part. And if you're not interested in that, not a big deal. We're not offended at all. You're free to go. For everybody else, we'll be back in a minute. Test. Well, welcome back. We've been looking at the life of Peter, and we're getting later in his life now. And what I want to talk about today is a role that Peter had to develop as kind of one of the main leaders in the church, that a role that was absolutely essential if he was going to be an effective leader. And that was he had to become an encourager to others. He had to mentor others in a very encouraging, supportive way. And so I want to look at Peter's relationship to a guy we know as Mark, or John Mark. He wrote the second gospel in the New Testament part of the Bible. And so in 1 Peter, Peter is writing a letter, and he says, your sister church here in Babylon, and probably referring to Rome, it was a coded way of saying that, sends you greetings, and so does my son, Mark. Now, it's not his literal son, but Peter is saying he's become like a son. So let me tell you a little bit about this John Mark, because I think it's just fascinating to me. So if we go to Acts 12, we're going back to the beginning of the church. Peter's the new leader of the church in Israel, and it's growing like crazy. Persecution starts. Peter is arrested and put in prison. And we're told this, Peter finally came to his senses. And what happens in the middle of the night, an angel comes and taps him on the shoulder and breaks kind of his handcuffs and bonds, and he's free. Opens the prison gates. The guards are asleep, and Peter walks out free. So he releases him, and Peter's going, is it really true? The Lord has sent his angel and saved me from Herod and from what the Jewish leaders had planned to do to me, which was probably to kill him. When he realized this, he went to the home of Mary, the mother of John Mark, where many were gathered for prayer. So it seems that in this early church in Jerusalem, that John Mark's mom had a big house, and people started meeting there for church. And it became a center for the church in that part of the world. So John Mark meets Peter, gets to know Peter. We don't know about their involvement at this point. But then we go a little bit further, and we read about Barnabas and Paul, or Saul, and they are deciding that God has called them to go outside of the Jewish world to the Gentile world and tell them about Jesus. So in Acts 12 it says, when Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission to Jerusalem, they returned, taking John Mark with them. They picked John Mark and they said, we're going on a journey, a missionary journey. You are a young man that just seems so right for serving God. Would you like to come with us? And John Mark goes with them. And then they just get going on their mission. And we read in chapter 13, Paul and his companions then left Paphos by ship for Pamphylia, landing at the port town of Perga. There John Mark left them and returned to Jerusalem. Now we're going to see in just a minute that Paul was not happy about this. And so we don't know why John Mark left. It's very possible that where they were when John Mark left, they were just going to head up into some mountains to get to the next area. And those mountains were notorious for being full of bandits, criminals, who attacked and robbed people. Also, that was an area that was known for malaria. And so a lot of people got sick if they took that road to those churches. And so if that was the case, that John Mark might have just become afraid. I don't want to take that risk. That's too dangerous for me. I'm going home. It's possible. But he leaves. Now imagine, he knows that Paul's upset with him. So as he walks home, I imagine he's feeling, Paul probably is really disappointed in me. I've really let them down, and he's feeling some guilt. And then I think he's saying, Paul was all about willingness to make sacrifices for God so that people would come to know God. And I chickened out. I didn't make sacrifices. What does that say about me? And he's, you can imagine, he's just full of doubt and second-guessing himself and inner turmoil. And did I make the right decision? And there's guilt. There's all kinds of confusion going on inside of him. So then we come to Acts 15. Paul and Barnabas have gone on their first journey and come back. Now they're getting ready to go on a second journey. And it says, after some time, Paul said to Barnabas, let's go back and visit each city where we previously preached to see how they're doing. Let's go back to the churches we planted and just check up on them and encourage them. Barnabas agreed and wanted to take along John Mark. But Paul disagreed strongly, since John Mark had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in their work. Their disagreement, Paul and Barnabas, was so sharp that they separated. They split. They had a big fight. And Paul said, I'm going my way. Barnabas says, I'm going my way. Barnabas took John Mark with him and sailed for Cyprus. Can you imagine how John Mark must have felt after seeing these two men who were very powerful, significant leaders, men that he respected and really wanted them to be proud of him? They're fighting over him. And Paul, considered to be probably at that point one of the greatest leaders in the church in the world, did not want John Mark on his team. He saw John Mark as a failure. He saw John Mark as somebody who had let him down and God down and didn't deserve another chance. I can imagine that just must have tore Mark apart. And I wonder if he was starting to wonder, have I lost my chance to ever serve God again? Is the word going to get out now that Paul does not want me, and if Paul doesn't want me, then probably everybody else says, well, we don't want him either. Because if Paul sees him as a loser, then we better not take him on. And so I think Mark went through this very depressing time, this grieving time, this confusing time. But then, just imagine he gets a phone call from Peter, and Peter probably just showed up. But Peter says to him, I just heard what happened with you, Barnabas and Paul. And you know, when I heard what happened to you and why Paul responded the way he did, it reminded me of my story. You see, you failed, Paul. I failed Jesus greatly. I walked away from Jesus at the time of his greatest need. I denied that I even knew him. And I thought I had failed too greatly, and I thought God would never want to use me again. But Mark, understand this. How great leaders respond to you does not necessarily mean that's how God feels about you. Don't base your perception of self just on what other people say. Look at what God says about you. And God took me after my failure and taught me through that and made me the leader I am today. I think he wants to do that with you as well. So I would like you on my team. I would like you to work with me. And Peter takes him under his wing and mentors him. And you want to know what happened? This young man who felt like such a failure, felt like he had blown his chances, gets to this place with Peter where he's mentored, and then he writes the story of Jesus. And what's interesting about Mark's gospel is that we read in Mark's gospel stuff about Peter that isn't mentioned in any other gospel. So that's why we go, Mark's gospel is basically Peter's story that Peter shared with Mark over the years, and Mark wrote it down. But guess how many people Mark's gospel has impacted in the world? Millions and millions of people have been impacted by the writing of a man who failed miserably, but who had a Peter who had also failed miserably, but had been forgiven and restored and grew from it. And he came and he helped Mark know that he was forgiven and restored him and mentored him, and he became greatly effective for God. That is the possibility for everyone who fails. Others might reject you and see you as a write-off, but that doesn't mean God has. And God can still use you. Let's pray. Father, I just thank you for this beautiful story of Peter's heart after his own failure for others who had failed, and his ability to encourage and to nurture them and see them become effective for you. And I pray you'd encourage anyone listening, if they're going through failure, to know that they're loved and can be forgiven. Amen. Well, that's the end of our evening. Thank you again for being here.